Welcome to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. I'm your host, Amanda Thomas, and today we're talking to biologist Dr. Wenfei Tong about her love for birds, her art, and her books. Wenfei spoke at one of our Science on Tap online events back in September 2020 about her book, Understanding Bird Behavior. We had such a great time at that event that I've invited her back to talk about her other book called Bird Love, The Family Life of Birds. She'll be speaking about bird love at a free Science on Tap online event on March 10, 2021 at 7 p.m. Pacific. Her publisher, Princeton Press, is offering a 30% discount on her books through April 30, 2021 if you buy it through their site. I'll put all kinds of links in the episode notes for the upcoming event, the book discount, how to find Wenfei's blog and artwork, and how to find the recording of her talk from last September. Wenfei grew up in Singapore, and we talked a lot about how living in an urban environment shaped her love of animals and her love of drawing. She currently lives in Montana, where her fun side job is taking people out in the wilderness to do birding on horseback for her company, Big Sky Safari. We talked about how she's traveled all over the world teaching people about science, and we also talked about how being both Asian and a woman has impacted her career and her life as a scientist. Quick note before we get to the interview, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast. It improves our numbers and helps new listeners find us. With that, here we go. Today we are joined by Dr. Wenfei Tong. Welcome, Wenfei.
Thank you so much for having me, Amanda.
I would love to have you describe your area of expertise, where you work, what you do. Please tell us about yourself.
My interests and my research is quite all over the place, but I grew up in a city. I grew up in Singapore. And from before I could speak, I was really fascinated by animals and just non-humans in general. And so very early on, I imprinted on, the TV set, which had these documentaries of grasslands like the Serengeti Plains in East Africa and places like that. And I came to the US for college and got to travel all over the world, including Montana and Alaska, as well as some beautiful places in Africa. And that's partly, both that and books are what got me really interested in being a scientist and trying to study wild animals in wild places. And so since then, I've written a couple of books on bird behavior because I've become a very keen birder ever since I was about 12. And that's really what's driven me more recently, is this interest in birds and in connecting people to the importance of appreciating the environment that they're in, the natural world that they're in, and doing that through using birds as ambassadors for nature.
I'm interested in your childhood in Singapore because I have not been there, but my impression of it is that it is a very urban landscape, and it is intriguing to me about you growing up to be a biologist, living in that or growing up in that space And I'm thinking about people these days who are often stuck in their homes, many of whom are in urban environments. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I've always had fantastic mentors, but I think my earliest mentors were my parents and really other species, and books were my two main things. So I didn't discover birds till I was about 12, but before that I was just obsessed by anything that had to do with a non-human. And I was a very, very shy kid. So if my parents were going to take me to someone's house or introduce me to a person, they would have to do it by the person's dog. Like, I would know the dog of every friend that they had. I would know the dog's name, but I wouldn't care much about the human's name. Or I think one of the anecdotes my mother likes to tell is that when I was just learning to speak, I would point at the walls where she had all these little nursery rhyme animal pictures on them. And I would make sounds for the different animals. And one day I was saying ba ba at a sheep. And my poor father came past and thought, oh my goodness, she's finally calling me Papa, which is father in Chinese. And he was swiftly disabused of that by my mother. So, since I was about 3, I was obsessively drawing horses and dogs all the time and just wanting to go up and hug every dog I saw. And that translated later into books because I'm an only child. So really the only way I amused myself from very early on was to read. And I think when I was about 6, I read Animal Farm, and I really liked that book because it was all about, to me, it was all about animals. And I think my mother tried to explain about Russian communism and things like that, but to me, it was really about injustice among animals. And so I think I never really saw much of a distinction between humans and non-humans from as early as I can remember. And this was a bit frustrating growing up in Singapore because all the large animals I could see were on the television screen or in books, in picture books, until I discovered birds. So before that, it was dogs, 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 because there were dogs around. And so I would memorize all these dog breeds. And then when I was 12, a bird nested right outside my bathroom window. And I suddenly noticed that and thought, oh, I really need to know what that is, just as I wanted to know what all the African mammals on the TV screen were. And that just got me hooked on birds. And suddenly it was like this whole world opened up to me. And it was a really rich experience learning about what all these birds were and what they did. And I've realized since that birds have this lovely feature of being very ubiquitous and very easy to see almost anywhere you are in the world. So I can be in the middle of New York City in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and I hear and see birds all day long. And it makes me feel very connected to the rest of the world. I never felt lonely right throughout the pandemic, largely because I had the birds there with me.
I lived in Manhattan a long time ago, and I can remember being really struck by hearing the noise of, I'm not sure if it was falcons but the falcon cry, because I lived very close to Central Park. And
maybe red-tailed hawks?
Maybe, yeah. And but hearing that from my window in this incredibly urban environment was really heartwarming to me. So I get a sense of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Or even before, so I moved to New York City from Alaska, and the transition was very hard on me because I thought I'd finally escaped living in a big city. I grew up in Singapore, and once I got to experience bigger skies and bigger places, I didn't ever want to go back to a big city. But here I was in New York City, and I was on the 47th floor in downtown Manhattan, and feeling a bit depressed. And then these peregrine falcons would come zooming past the window and do these aerial displays. And it was so uplifting to see them. It really made me feel less alone in this big city.
I can completely relate to that. That's wonderful. You mentioned that you have written a couple of books, and we had you on our Science on Tap online event back in last September to talk about one of your books, and we're having you speak in March of 2021 on another one of your books. So tell us about your books.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, they're both about bird behavior. And like I said earlier, I think the motivation for all this came about just from knowing a lot about birds and identifying a lot about with birds. And, the advice is always to write about what you know best rather than something else. So I think the underlying message is very much inspired by a lot of writers that I enjoyed, especially growing up, such as Gerald Durrell, who is a British writer and started one of the first zoos purely for conservation reasons. So he used to start, he got to start catching a lot of animals for the London Zoo. And then he started his own zoo because he realized that there were all these underappreciated smaller animals like frogs that were going extinct. And everyone just wanted to see lions and tigers and elephants. So he started writing just to make money for his zoo, to support his zoo. But he had this facility with English, with the language, as well as with describing people as though they're animals and animals as though they're people. And he's very, very funny. So I read that a lot growing up, as well as people like Alfred Russel Wallace, who did his first expedition in the Malay archipelago, so in Singapore, near Singapore, where I come from, and also, of course, Charles Darwin. But those books and lots of others made me want to write another book that would possibly inspire other people to really identify with nature or with other species and use that to make them care for the environment. So, people like David Attenborough and Jane Goodall are huge role models for me and always have been. But I don't study chimpanzees, and I don't have the ability to prance around in front of a TV screen and get lots and generations of people excited. So I thought, well, maybe if I write a book or two that have a lot of nice pictures in them, people will learn that birds are not so different from humans and worth getting interested in. And then through that, get to really appreciate nature and want to do something about things like the climate crisis that we're going through.
I'm amused by your imagery of David Attenborough prancing. So
well, he
just had to call
prance,
that out.
Actually.
I know.
And
still,
we're very glad to know that he's got his, he's safely vaccinated, so he can keep inspiring all of us.
Yes, indeed. So your two books are, well, the first one was Bird Love, correct? And then the second one is Understanding Bird Behavior. Tell us about those two books. So
Bird Love started partly because I suppose a lot of my own research has been on things like social behavior, or more broadly on cooperation and conflict among animals, both within and between species. And so one of the things I studied in Zambia were what we call brood parasitic birds that essentially outsource all the childcare, which I'm sure a lot of parents at this time would identify closely with. And so the motivation behind Bird Love was twofold, actually. One was to get people interested in science, to sort of demystify science, and also to inspire an appreciation for other species. But the other was just to do this through telling all sorts of fascinating stories about bird behavior that people might not necessarily know about. And also to point out the fact that nature and evolution are largely amoral. They're not. So it's very hard to use any sort of animal behavior to advocate for what we should or shouldn't do in our interactions with each other. That love can be a double-edged sword, basically. So things like these brood parasitic birds that farm their kids out to other species to take care of, there's quite a lot of death and manipulation going on, in addition to feelings of pure, beautiful love. And in my second book, which is more broad, Understanding Bird Behavior, which is published under other titles overseas, in the UK and Australia. In that one, I was trying harder to just talk about bird behavior in general, and also to highlight non-white and non-male scientists. So I got to be chattier in that book and to tell a lot more anecdotes, which I liked. Like there's a Egyptian vulture that I got to meet, and so I talk about him in person, things like that. But I also tried to tell more stories behind the science that went on to explain some of the behaviors that I discuss in the book. And if there was any kind of, especially scientists not from America or Europe or Australia that I could bring in, I would try to do so. And if they were female, or especially if they were not even professional scientists, but examples of community science, then I would try to highlight that as well. And so I think there I'm trying to not just claim, but to show that science is or can be a very democratic, egalitarian process if we let it be.
You are an amazing artist, and we'll put links to your photography and your art in the episode notes. How did you get involved in art? You said that as a child you were drawing dogs and horses, but are you professionally or academically trained?
Yeah, sadly, I'm not. I think I have this really horrible, independent, stubborn streak in me that really showed up in the case of drawing. or painting. I don't know where it came from. I mean, I must be partly that I was just an only child and rather left to my own devices a lot in terms of finding ways to amuse myself. My mother's very, very artistic, and she would have loved to be an architect. She's a doctor, but she's definitely got a fantastic eye for things. So I'm sure she just gave me a bunch of pencils or something and said, well, you can draw all these things. Why don't you go and amuse yourself? But I was really, really passionate about drawing from the age of about 3. That's the only thing I remember having temper tantrums about, was that I couldn't get my hands to execute a horse the way I saw it in my head. And my mother would come home and I would have this meltdown. I mean, she would find me just in tears on the floor because I hadn't been able to draw a horse and I'd been trying all morning long. So there's no formal training, but there was a heck of a lot of practice from very, very early on. And I'm sure if I had more other distractions and if I'd been able to run around outdoors more, things like that, I might not have spent so much time drawing. But it's most of what I did, it's mainly drawing and reading, I think.
Your blog, I believe, is called Darwin's Jackal. Where does that name come from?
So that blog started much earlier on when I was in graduate school. Again, procrastinating. I think I was thinking about other things to do other than pure academia and being a research scientist. And a friend had an idea that I should just start putting little bits and pieces that I either painted or wrote on a blog. And one of my long-abiding interests is the history of science and the history of evolutionary biology. And so Thomas Henry Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog because Darwin himself was this rather sweet, self-effacing person who liked to hide in his house in the country. And, he came up with very, very slightly inflammatory ideas like evolution by natural selection, which he didn't really want to have to do battle over all the time in London. So he had friends like Huxley, who were just very much more combative and in the thick of it in science, in the scientific scene in London. And so Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog. And because at that time I was in the program of evolutionary biology and I was aspiring to be an evolutionary biologist, but with his interest in the history of science, I thought maybe I would call my blog Darwin's Jackal. And then I think the subtitle is something like Scraps of Opinion, because it's a play on the fact that jackals are essentially scavengers. And also because if I had to pick an animal that I am, it would probably be something like a jackal or a coyote or one of these scrappy little canids that are running around and sometimes social, sometimes not, and picking up on opportunities here and there.
So part of why I do this podcast is because I want to, as I mentioned before we started, I want to demystify science and scientists. And so what is something that you wish people knew about science?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was thinking, and I have been thinking for quite some time, that in some ways, all organisms with any kind of brain or sentience, and you could include plants in this, are evolved to perform a certain amount of science. And what I mean by that is we perceive the environment, so we gather data through our senses, and then our nervous systems, whatever they are, form some kind of hypotheses about cause and effect, about how the world works. And then based on more observations, we sort of refine these notions of what causes what. And sometimes this badly backfires, like, apocryphal notions of people doing rain dances or any kind of myth or religious belief is essentially slightly confusing cause and effect, right? So I think what's so great about modern science as we know and define it is it's trying to avoid those kinds of accidents and biases that we might be prone to. And some of those biases are also very deeply rooted in our evolutionary, in the way our brains have evolved and in our psychology. So I think that in itself, the tendency to discriminate, has a very deep psychological evolutionary past in our brains. And so science is designed to try and avoid some of these biases. It doesn't do a perfect job because none of us are perfect and we are all human. So even in spite of our best efforts, we are subject to fashions and whatever someone else who is a very influential scientist or someone you admire thinks, you're more likely to believe them than otherwise. But at least science tries to avoid this. We don't have any other mental tool with which to understand the world and make decisions that tries so hard explicitly, like systematically, to avoid these biases. And in that sense, I think science is a really crucial tool and something that is really sadly underappreciated right now, especially in America, when there are so many things happening, both on short time scales, relatively short time scales like the pandemic, and much longer time scales like the climate crisis, which we really need to do something about and which are very hard for our brains to wrap themselves around because of the scale of the problem. It's like too many people involved or the time scale is too long. And at least science can help us understand that. I guess the last thing I would say about science is that it's one of the things that's hardest for our brains to wrap themselves around is how probability really works. I suppose the other thing that I wanted to say about science is that it's often accused of being very dispassionate and somewhat anti-religion or anti-morality. And I don't think that's true at all. I think any scientist I know personally or that I can think of is very much inspired by an almost spiritual love of something. Maybe it's just trying to find out the truth, but very often for biologists, it's a love of the natural world. And it's amazing that there's this much quoted phrase that science is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. And I think that's so true. There's a lot of slog that goes into science because it's all about replicating things enough times that something's convincing evidence. And yet to get you through that 99% perspiration, there are very, very few people who have enough of the 1% inspiration to get them through all that blood, sweat, and tears.
So you mentioned earlier, and I want to circle back now to the idea of being a woman in science and being a non-white scientist. You mentioned that in your second book, Understanding Bird Behavior, you had tried to specifically seek out people who were not your stereotypical white male scientist with a lab coat on, I assume. So can you talk about what it's like to be a woman in science, what it's like to be a non-white scientist? Would love to hear about your experience.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's really interesting because I think if you'd asked me this question maybe 5 years ago, I wouldn't have said I'd noticed anything different. And then since then, I've realized that there are quite a lot of differences that I've been forced to be aware of at times because partly through some of my own experiences, I have become the subject of, I have experienced some harassment and discrimination, and some of it was so blatant. It was like, oh, okay, this really is something to pay attention to. For instance, I was once told indirectly, a student had complained to the president of the university that I couldn't possibly be competent to teach this class on introductory biology because it turns out the student was, I didn't know this at the time, but it turns out the student was also largely a science denier. So climate change denier and evolution denier and everything else. But the main objection levied against me was that my language skills were not up to the task. So I shouldn't be lecturing to 300 students because I couldn't speak English properly was the objection. So that really gobsmacked me and made me realize, okay, there really are some people who have made up their minds and whom it will be very, very hard to convince otherwise. And doubly hard for someone that they're already prejudiced against for reasons that have nothing to do with science. I was trying to teach things like, evolution, and there was a lot about climate change and community science in this class because it was an introductory science class. And so that really made me realize what I was up against. And I think since then, it's been really important to me to try and meet people where they are. And I think I've had some luck in that because people don't like to feel surprised when it becomes threatening. But if you can find common ground with them, that makes you less threatening. And a lot of people will probably look at me. I mean, I've had a lot of people assume, for instance, that I must be very much younger than I am and vegetarian. And I wish I were vegetarian for all sorts of ethical and environmental reasons, but I'm not really vegetarian because I do like meat and I actually like hunting. So this brings me back to the meeting people where they are, is when I say things to certain people about how much I like horses, and if they see that I can stay on a horse, or that I like hunting, that I'm not completely anti-gun, or that I've got a lot of ranching friends, that really helps diffuse a lot of the tension. And I think I do this too, that I make a lot of, it's very natural for humans to stereotype. And I think this is borne out in biology. So it's really natural for us to classify organisms and to want to see them as distinct species and then to name those species. And we do that with each other, right? We do that culturally with human groups all the time. So I'm always doing that when I try and figure out what animal someone reminds me of. And in fact, I'm doing it in multiple ways. I'm stereotyping the animals and I'm stereotyping the people. But anyway, I think one of the most important things here is to be aware of all the unconscious bias that goes on. So the other thing that really came home to me is that there's a lot of evidence beyond my personal experience that women or groups that think of themselves as being discriminated against are often some of the worst offenders. So there is quite a lot of evidence that if you do experiments, psychology experiments with the names taken off CVs, and you have applicants of both sexes, and then you look at the sex of the people making the judgments on these applicants, it turns out that, I mean, some of these studies are quite old now, so I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time these studies were done, women were often harder on other women applicants than the men who were making the judgments were on the women. So I mean, the women were being more sexist than the men, is the punchline of that. And when I read that, I thought, wow, you actually see some of this anecdotally, but to have the numbers is quite sobering. And so at least to be aware of that, I think, is a first step. And yeah, there's all sorts of stereotyping that I've noticed people find that causes people to find me surprising. So I think you often don't see an Asian female and assume that they're particularly outdoorsy, or that there have been times when I've been in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, where Chinese people get such a bad rap because of traditional Chinese medicine that I've been a little worried about going around and having people assume that I'm just another Chinese person there to either exploit the Africans in a new form of colonialism or as part of this poaching, part of the market for the poaching trade. That's something I've not encountered head on, but I do think people probably make those assumptions.
I wanted to also ask a little bit more. You mentioned when you were talking about doing the writing for your book that you were talking to more community-based scientists and people who aren't perhaps somebody in academia. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I first got involved in that sort of activity, well, I suppose actually really early on as a high school student, where I was volunteer nature guiding and things like that. And so I became very active in the local nature society, and a lot of bird societies like Audubon always do bird surveys as a way to get some kind of data from a lot of these very, very eager amateur birders who are super skilled at what they do. And it's this wonderful untapped resource. And there are lots of papers now that have used bird sighting records and bird surveys performed by amateurs, not non-professionals, by community members for decades in a lot of countries. So these people have just generated fantastic databases that scientists are now using. And then I became more directly involved with this as a scientist in Montana, because the National Bison Range there, which is currently very excitingly going back to tribal, being managed by the tribes rather than by the US government, they were very interested in looking at the effects of things like bison grazing or other land management techniques on the grassland birds. And grassland birds are a particularly fragile very vulnerable group of birds that tend to get hammered by things like pesticides all the time. And they're often sort of little brown birds, so they're not as charismatic as something like a macaw or a beautiful bird of paradise or something. So people tend to write them off a bit. And they're notoriously hard to survey because very often they all look so similar that the best way to survey them is by hearing them. To identify them is by hearing them. And so I got involved in, and also the bison range, like a lot of other environmental institutions, is just really underfunded. So I just thought, well, this would be a really good chance to increase visitor involvement and get visitors to know more about what they're seeing, but also harness the visitors to actually contribute data to what the bison range needs to know, because they just don't have the resources to pay a bunch of undergraduates or scientists to run around the hills all day every summer to collect the necessary data. So I helped them create a sort of bird tour type of pamphlet. So it's basically a bird survey procedure that explicitly involved any visitor who wanted to be involved at the bison range. And the idea here was to, kill two birds with one stone, forgive the pun, and make the actual management and science on the bison range more accessible to visitors, and also help the bison range out in terms of collecting data.
You also lead safaris, big sky safaris. Yes. You mentioned being in Montana, and can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I love Montana. It's so funny because I've been this rolling stone for most of my life, and I grew up in Singapore never really feeling like I absolutely belonged there. And it's not anything against Singapore, and there are lots of friends there, but it was just so urban that I think I never quite bonded to it the way I have to Montana. And so since then, I've taken a lot of friends who visited out and around, and they suggested that I should just start a business doing this, because they had a lot of fun, and so did I. And maybe I should try and spread the word more broadly. And the other impetus for this is when I was in graduate school, we used to have these, Harvard has a nice natural history museum. And so the university would organize very, very high-end trips to places like Tanzania on safari or the Galapagos. And they would usually get some important faculty member to come and give guest lectures on the trip. But if an important faculty member couldn't be found, then they got Wenfei to come in. And I loved it because I got a free ride and I got to go to these places I couldn't afford to go to otherwise and talk to people about the environment that they were in and the biology of the animals and the plants they were seeing. And I loved it. So that was a very early introduction to that kind of travel. And now, I mean, I don't really do this as something that pays the bills. It's turned into a sort of form of environmental advocacy almost, or outreach. And one of the other things I've done is to partner a lot with other outfitters or guest ranchers in the area who have very ethical environmental principles as well. And so because of the pandemic, I didn't really take anyone except for a outfitted horse trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which I do every year with a group called the Seven Lazy Pea Outfitters. And they're a group that have their horses and the mules right on the edge of this beautiful, pristine area of wilderness that's just south of Glacier National Park. And we take people in for about 8 days on horseback. And it's wilderness, meaning that there are no roads, there's pretty much no cell phone coverage, no contact with any outsiders, no machinery allowed. So even the Forest Service isn't allowed to bring a chainsaw in to cut down, to do trail maintenance. Everything is done by hand, and it's very, what you could call a very transformative experience for visitors. And so I go as a sort of talking head where if we're not seeing anything particularly exciting and everyone's starting to flag in their fourth hour of sitting on a horse, then I tell entertaining stories about the wildflowers or the landscape or the birds that we're hearing and just keep people entertained. And it's just provide an extra appreciation for the wilderness that they're experiencing.
Well, that sounds really fun. I would love to be able to participate in something like that. That sounds wonderful, to have your own personal tour guide showing you and talking to you about all of the fascinating things that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I love it because it's such a great way to meet really interesting people from all walks of life.
So I just have one more question. What is your favorite thing about being a scientist?
I suppose this is a great segue from the touring, because I think it's the people that I've had the chance to meet, not just other scientists, but the different ranchers or students or just landowners who have allowed me to catch mice or watch birds or do whatever funny experiment I'm doing on their land. That's been really enlightening and very inspiring. They're just people that you don't expect to be so passionate or so idealistic or so talented at what they do. And then they pop up all over the place. And I'm sure everyone meets people like that. But I think as a scientist with the opportunities to travel and some of the access I've had, it's been really just very fulfilling and gives me hope for the future.
It's nice to feel hopeful.
It is.
That is something we're perhaps lacking a little bit these days. So it's nice to have a hopeful perspective.
I mean, that's sort of the subject of my next book that I'm working on right now, is to draw on some of the experiences, some of the families that I've gotten to know in Kenya, Zambia, and Montana, who are ranching families, and they're trying to still keep on some of their traditional way of life in these grasslands, and to tell their stories, but also to use that to show how some of these people have found some very promising solutions to living sustainably in a very vulnerable landscape, and use that to tell some of the history and biology of the place as well.
Well, I look forward to seeing that book when you get that finished. When will that be coming out?
Oh, I don't know.
Still in the works.
Yeah, still in the works.
Well, with that, I think we will finish up our discussion this afternoon. I want to say thanks to Wenfei Tong and invite you all back to see our Science on Tap online on March 10th when she talks about bird love.
Oh, thank you, Amanda.
Yep, looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks for listening. Remember to check out our episode notes for links and come join us for Wenfei's talk on bird love on March 10. Also, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. It really helps a lot. A quick thank you to Matthew Taylor at Princeton Press for connecting me with Wenfei in the first place. Also, thank you to Chet Lyster for producing this episode. Finally, thanks to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song, Mandelbrot Set.